Hello and welcome to Once Upon a Time. We know that this is your favorite library show where we read stories to you. And so glad to have you here. I'm Catherine Poulter and
I am Becca Hyde.
And we have for you so many good stories today.
Yes.
Mine are not so spooky, but well, I guess you could maybe get a little chilled by some of them. I don't know. We'll see. But the first book I have for you is one of my new favorites. It's called Quackers, and it's by Liz Wong. And there are two ducks on the cover, if you can see. Here's one, and here's one. Quackers. Meow. Quackers is a duck. He knows he is a duck because he lives at the duck pond with all of the other ducks. And everyone he knows is a duck. Duck, 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 duck. Duck, duck, duck. Duck. But sometimes he feels like he doesn't quite fit in. He often has trouble communicating. Meow, 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 quack. He doesn't care much for his dinner options. Slugs, snails, seeds, worms, algae, duckweed. Not duckweed again. Most of all, he hates getting wet. Then one day, Quackers met a strange duck. Meow? Meow. Quackers was overjoyed. You understand me? Of course I do. I've never met a duck who understood me. Duck? Wait a second. You think you're a duck? The strange duck, whose name turned out to be Mittens, seemed to find something very amusing. Ha 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 ha! He thinks he's a duck. Mittens thought for a moment and said, You'd better come with me. That's where I live. Come on. Quackers had never been anywhere so entirely unlike home. Inside was a whole flock of strange ducks. Ducks just like Quackers. Just look at all those ducks. We're cats, silly. We chase mice. Way more fun than swimming. Drink milk. So much tastier than duckweed. And we clean ourselves. Well, this isn't quite as exciting. You'll get used to it. Before long, Quackers felt right at home. Quackers liked being a cat, but he began to miss the duck pond. He missed the rustle of the wind through the reeds. He missed snuggling under a warm, feathery wing. He even missed the taste of duckweed. This isn't so bad. And when he arrived at the pond, he realized that most of all he missed his friends. Quack, 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 quack. Now Quackers spends part of his days at the farm, chasing mice, fun, drinking milk, yum, and cleaning himself. This part is still not that great. And part at the pond. Who wants duckweed? Quack, 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 quack. Quackers is a duck, and Quackers is a cat. But most of all, he's just Quackers, and that makes him completely happy. The end. Isn't that a sweet story?
Fine book.
Yes.
Well, I wanted to start out reading a book by one of my favorite writers.
Oh, yes.
I love the writing by Cynthia Rylant, and I found this book. This is the first book that she wrote. When I Was Young in the Mountains, and it's illustrated by Diane Good, and she wrote it because she was inspired from her own life living in the mountains of Appalachia when her grandparents raised her, and she lived with them.
Oh, nice.
There in the mountains. When I was young in the mountains, Grandfather came home in the evening, covered with the black dust of a coal mine. Only his lips were clean, and he used them to kiss the top of my head. When I was young in the mountains, Grandmother spread the table with hot cornbread, pinto beans, and fried okra. Later, in the middle of the night, she walked through the grass with me to the Johnny house and held my hand in the dark. I promised never to eat more than one serving of okra again. When I was young in the mountains, we walked across the cow pasture and through the woods carrying our towels. The swimming hole was dark and muddy, and we sometimes saw snakes, but we jumped in anyway. On our way home, we stopped at Mr. Crawford's for a mound of white butter. Mr. Crawford and Mrs. Crawford looked alike and always smelled of sweet milk. When I was young in the mountains, we pumped pails of water from the well at the bottom of the hill and heated the water to fill a round tin tub for our baths. And afterwards, we stood in front of the old black stove, shivering and giggling, while Grandmother heated cocoa on top. When I was young in the mountains, we went to church in the schoolhouse on Sundays, and sometimes walked with the congregation through the cow pasture to the dark swimming hole for baptisms. My cousin Peter was laid back into the water, and his white shirt stuck to him, and my grandmother cried. When I was young in the mountains, we listened to frogs sing at dusk and awoke to cowbells outside our windows. Sometimes a black snake came in the yard, and my grandmother would threaten it with the hoe. If it did not leave, she used the hoe to kill it. 4 of us once draped a very long snake, dead of course, across our necks for a photograph. When I was young in the mountains, we sat on the porch swing in the evenings, and Grandfather sharpened my pencils with his pocket knife. Grandmother sometimes shelled beans and sometimes braided my hair. The dogs lay around us, and the stars sparkled in the sky. A bob white whistled in the forest. Bob, bob, bob white. When I was young in the mountains, I never wanted to go to the ocean, and I never wanted to go to the desert. I never wanted to go anywhere else in the world, for I was in the mountains. And that was always enough. The end.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Isn't that beautiful?
What a beautiful story. Well, I chose an old fairy tale that's called The Reward Worth Having. I like this story, and it has really beautiful illustrations also. But these beautiful illustrations, which were illustrated by Mercer Mayer, were done a long, long time ago. This book is 40 years old. The Reward Worth Having. There were 3 friends who had been soldiers of the king, and now they were marching home again. They had feathers in their hats, knapsacks on their backs, swords by their sides, but not a penny in their pockets. One was a big burly man named Pete. The second was a thin and sharp man, and he was named Dirk. And the third was curly-haired and merry, and his name was Felix. They followed the dusty road over ups and downs, and came at last to the center of a dark wood. The wind was blowing chill, and they stopped to rest beneath an oak tree, rubbing their hands and stamping their feet. "It's getting late," said Pete. "We'd better push on as fast as we can so that we can get to the town before nightfall." "What will we do when we get there?" said Felix. "We haven't any money." "Maybe we can find work," said Dirk. "And if not, we can sell our swords for enough to buy shelter and a bit of bread and cheese." They set off again, but they hadn't gone 3 steps before Felix stopped them. "Listen," he said. "I hear something." Over the rush of the wind and the branches, they heard a tiny voice of piping. "It sounds like someone's calling for help," said Felix. "Let's go and see." "I don't know," said Pete slowly, scratching his head. "If we don't get on, we'll have to spend the night out in the cold." But Felix had already started in the direction of the voice. After a moment, the others followed him, grumbling. Not far away they found a great rock. One side of it was flat, and in it there was a door made out of the rock itself. A little man, no bigger than a rabbit, was hopping about in front of it and squeaking in a voice like chalk scraping on a blackboard. He had a long white beard, and the end of it was caught in the closed stone door. "Help me, will you?" he cried when he saw the three. "Why don't you just open the door?" said Pete. "Because it's locked," yelled the little man. "And the key is on the inside. The wind slammed it shut as I was standing here, and my beard was blown into it as it closed. Do something." Pete rapped the door with his knuckles. "Nothing we can do," he said. "The door's stone. We can't break it down." Dirk said, "What reward will you give us if we help you?" "We don't need a reward to help somebody," said Felix. He turned to the little man. "Is there another way into your house? Because if there is one of us could go in and open this door." "There's another way," said the little man, "but it's too small for any of you." "Well, well," said Dirk, "if we can't get the door off the beard, we can get the beard off the door." He turned to Pete. "You're the best swordsman of the three. Cut it off." Pete drew his sword and with one slash cut off the end of the little man's beard close to the door, as neatly as if it had been done with scissors. The little man blinked. He looked cross-eyed down at the end of his beard. Then he jumped into the air and clicked his heels together. In another instant he had whisked out of sight behind the rock. "He's gone," said Dirk. "I knew we should have made him give us a reward first." But as he spoke, the stone door swung open. The little man stood inside with a lantern. "Come in," he said, "for it's cold standing on the doorstep." They hunched themselves over, and in they went. They walked behind the little man down a hallway and into a large chamber where they could stand upright. A bright fire was burning in a stone fireplace, and by its light they saw that the walls were all streaked with gold and silver. The chairs and tables were carved out of whole diamonds, and on one of the tables stood 3 bird cages. "Now," said the little man, "you may each choose your reward." They looked at the cages more closely. In one was a bird made all of gold, shining in the firelight. In the second was a bird of iron, every feather and every claw as delicately as a real bird. And in the third was a small gray bird, and it was alive. Pete rubbed his chin. "Which of us is to choose first?" "It doesn't matter," replied the little man, "for each of you will choose what he most wants, and nothing else." "Good," said Dirk. "Then I choose the golden bird. It must be worth a fortune." Pete said, "Oh, that's too gaudy for me. I choose the iron bird. It looks strong and hard." "Well, as for me," said Felix, "I prefer the real bird." He whistled softly to it, and it gave a low, sweet chirp. The 3 friends took up the 3 cages. The little man showed them to the door, and off they went again on their road. They came to the gates of the town as night was falling. The streets were dark, and they walked along, wondering where to go. They came at last to the front of a fine inn. Lights shone through the windows, and from inside came a good smell of roasting and baking. "Maybe I could give them my golden bird," said Dirk, "but I wish we had some money instead." As he said the words, the little golden bird opened its beak. It uttered a note like the chinking of coins, and from its beak dropped 3 gold pieces, which fell to the bottom of the cage. "That's what I call a reward worth having," said Dirk. He took the money out of the cage and led the way into the inn. The 3 friends ate and drank all they could hold. Then they asked for a room for the night. The landlord of the inn led them upstairs to a big room with 3 beds. And all the way he was looking out of the corners of his eyes at the golden bird in its cage. They were so tired they tumbled into bed and were soon fast asleep. In the middle of the night, the landlord with 2 of his servants tiptoed into the bedroom. As quick as winking, they threw ropes over the beds, and when the 3 friends awoke, they found themselves tied up as tightly as 3 parcels. "Now," said the landlord with a chuckle, "I will take this golden bird. I will tell everyone that you 3 tried to rob me, and so you will be thrown into prison. If I could get loose, I'd soon settle you," growled Pete. Oh, I wish I had a couple of soldiers here." No sooner had he spoken the words than the iron bird gave a harsh cry, like the clang of an iron gate. Out of thin air sprang 2 tall men dressed in red. They seized the landlord and his servants and threw them out of the door and down the stairs. They untied Pete, and then they vanished. "That's what I call a reward worth having," said Pete, as he untied his friends. There they are. Then, since they were soldiers, they pushed one of the beds against the door and went back to sleep. In the morning, when they came downstairs, the landlord was nowhere to be seen. With money from the Golden Bird, Dirk took a house. He furnished it with handsome things and hired servants. He bought some new clothes and very fine ones for himself, good ones for Pete, and plain ones for Felix. They all moved in and lived comfortably. Dirk had the best room, where he kept the Golden Bird, locked up in a cupboard. Pete had a good room, where he kept the Iron Bird in its cage, ready to guard the house, and Felix had a small room in the attic, where he hung the cage with the small gray bird in it. "For," said Dirk, "since you do nothing, you shall have the least." Soon after, word spread through the city that the daughter of the king was very ill. She was so ill that the doctors had given her up for lost. In desperation, the king said that anyone who thought he could cure her should come to the palace and would be given the chance. "Splendid," said Dirk. "Why shouldn't I try?" He dressed himself in his best, mounted a fine chestnut horse, and rode to the palace. After him, on a great black horse, went Pete, in armor and with a sword by his side. And last of all went Felix, trudging on foot and whistling. They were shown into the palace and taken to the princess's bedroom. There she lay in an immense white bed, but she was paler than the sheets and pillows. Her eyes were closed, and her dark hair was spread around her face like a cloud of sadness. Beside her sat the king and queen, as worried as if they were the poorest parents in the world. There they are. Dirk stepped forward proudly. He held up the cage with the Golden Bird in it. At a word from him, gold coins dropped from its beak. They clinked on the floor of the cage and piled up higher and higher, but the princess neither stirred nor opened her eyes. "That is a marvelous thing," said the king. "You shall be the treasurer of my kingdom, but you have not cured my daughter, and she is more precious to me than wealth." Then Pete stepped forward. He held up the cage with the Iron Bird in it. At a word from him, it gave its clanging cry. Out of thin air jumped the two tall men in red. They drew shining swords and clashed them together. They swung them in flashing circles in the air. Then they vanished. They might as well have done nothing, for the princess never moved. "I have never seen such a sight," said the king. "You shall be my captain of the army. But you have not cured my daughter, and she is more precious to me than power." Dirk and Pete bowed and stood back, and the queen wiped the tears from her eyes with her lace handkerchief. Felix came forward and sat down on the edge of the bed. He opened the cage and took out the small gray bird. It perched on his finger and blinked a round black eye. He whistled to it, and it gave a low, sweet chirrup. The princess opened her eyes. "Life calls to life," said Felix. He held out his finger with the bird upon it. The princess smiled faintly. She reached out her hand, and the bird hopped to her finger. It fluffed out its feathers and trilled. She lifted her other hand and gently stroked its head. It began to sing, and its singing filled the room as if someone had thrown open a window and let in the summer. "She is well," said the king, "and if she will have you, you shall be her husband." The princess smiled again, and looking at Felix's merry face, she nodded. Felix looked into her eyes, which were as gray as the sea. "That," he said, "is a reward worth having." The end.
Oh, thank you.
So
Thank
sweet.
you. And now I have for you a spooky story from long ago when deep in the woods the goblins lied in wait. And in this book they are called the Habyas. And that is the title of this book, written by Robert D. Sansucci and illustrated by Alexei Nachev. The Habyas. By moonlight and by starlight, within the forest deep, the Habyas plot their mischief, while good folks are asleep. Once upon a time, and twice upon a time, there was a little girl, an orphan, who was raised by an old man and an old woman. They lived together in a tiny house made of hemp stalks. It was guarded by the old man's 5 dogs named Turpy, Topi, Tippy, Terry, and Teeny. The house was at the edge of a great forest, and deep in the woods lived the Habyas. They had fur and claws and pointed ears and sharp teeth and tails, half again as long as themselves. They slept by day, crept through the woods by night, and plotted against the people in the little hemp stalk house. One night, silent as the snakes that glide across the forest floor, silent as the will-o-wisps that haunt the reedy shore, the Habyas come. They wanted to tear down the house of hemp stalks, eat up the old man and woman, and carry off the little girl. But all the dogs barked, and Turpy barked loudest of all, so the Habyas ran off. The old man said, "Turpy barks so that I cannot sleep nor slumber, and if I live till morning, I will whip him and chase him away." Though the little girl begged him, "Please don't hurt Turpy," the old man whipped the poor animal and ran him off into the forest. The next night, hushed as autumn raindrops patting fallen leaves, hushed as fluttered bat wings underneath the eaves, the Habyas came again. "Habya, Habya, Habya," they whispered to each other. "Tear down the hemp stalks, eat up the old man and woman, carry off the little girl." Ugh. But the faithful dog Topi barked so that the Habyas ran off. The old woman complained to her husband, "Topi barks so that I cannot sleep nor slumber. In the morning you must whip him and chase him away." The next morning, ignoring the little girl's tears, the old man chased the dog into the woods. The following night, slyly as weasel spies a nest through narrowed eyes, shyly as a spider sets her snares for careless flies, the Habyas watched and waited. "Habya, Habya, Habya," they murmured. "Tear down the hemp stalks, eat up the old man and woman, carry off the little girl." But this time, Tippy sounded the alarm, barking and barking until the Habyas ran away. "That wretched Tippy barks so that I cannot sleep nor slumber," said the old man, "and if I live till morning, I will chase him into the woods." Sure enough, though the little girl begged him not to, and to show mercy, the old man would have none of it. He took his whip and chased the faithful hound away. The next night, greedy as the lean red fox that licks her hungry jaws, greedy as the owl that flexes his impatient claws, the Habyas came again. "Habya, Habya, Habya," they said to one another. "Tear down the hemp stalks, eat up the old man and woman, and carry off the little girl." But Terry barked so loudly that the Habyas ran off. Now the old man grumbled, "Little Terry barks so much I cannot sleep nor slumber. Husband, you must get rid of him just as you got rid of the others." "Please don't hurt Terry," the little girl pleaded, but the grown-ups told her to stand aside. They chased the unhappy hounds into the woods with the others. So on the following night, deadly as the winter snows for those who lose their way, deadly as the hawk that swoops on unsuspecting prey, the Habyas came. "Habya, Habya, Habya," they chattered to one another. "Tear down the hemp stalks, eat up the old man and woman, and carry off the little girl." But Teeny barked and barked so that the Habyas at last ran off. The old man threw open the shutters and shook his fist at the dog. "You bark so that I cannot sleep nor slumber," he shouted. "If I live till morning, I will drive you off just like the others." Sure enough, the very next thing in the morning, the old man beat the loyal dog and chased him away. Now the old man and woman and the little girl were all alone in the house at the edge of the woods. The next night, boldly as the bear whose mighty roaring shakes the moon, boldly as the wolves that sense the hunt is ending soon, the hobbyist came a last time. "Habya, habya, habya," they cried. "Tear down the hemp stalks, eat up the old man and woman, and carry off the little girl." When the hobbyist found that all 5 dogs were gone, they tore down the hemp stalk walls, ate up the old man and woman, and carried the little girl off in a bag. Now when the hobbyists came to their home, which was a nasty cave in the heart of the woods, they tossed the bag with the little girl inside it into a corner. Then, because dawn was coming and they sleep in the daytime, the hobbyists all nodded off. The little girl cried a great deal because she could not free herself from the bag. But the faithful dogs that had been chased into the woods heard her crying. They came and chewed a hole in the side of the bag, and the little girl crawled out. Then the 5 dogs hid in the bag, while the little girl waited outside the hobbyist cave. That night, the hobbyists woke and gathered around the bag. They knocked on the top of it and cried, "Look me! Look me!" But when they opened the bag, Turpy, Topi, Tippy, Terry, and Teeny jumped out and gobbled them all up. And that was the end of the hobbyists. Then the little girl and the 5 loyal dogs found their way out of the woods. They built a new house of hemp stalks for all of them to share. There they lived contentedly. And if they haven't gone away, they must be living there still. By moonlight and by starlight, from dusk until the dawn, good folk are sleeping soundly, with all the hobbyists gone. The end.
Habya, habya, habya. Oh, that's scary. But a good one.
Yes.
Here is a scary story too. It's about sharks. It's called Sean Loves Sharks. Sean Loves Sharks by Curtis Manley, and the pictures are by Tracy Subisiak. Here we go. Sean loves sharks. He loved their streamlined shapes. He loved their dark, blank eyes. He loved their big mouths full of sharp teeth. He loved how they could sneak up on something tasty and grab it with one big bite. Sean thought about sharks all the time. Chomp, 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 chomp. When Sean ate, he opened his mouth wide for each bite. Chomp, chomp, chomp. Sean watched shark videos, knew all the shark movies by heart, and had 127 shark books. At recess, Sean opened his mouth very wide and chased the other kids, especially Stacy, who screamed the loudest. Sean loved how everything got out of the way of a shark. Chomp, 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 chomp. On Monday, Ms. Mitchell told the class they would each learn about a different predator. Sean leapt out of his chair and yelled, "I get the shark! I get the shark!" "Please sit down, Sean. Everyone gets a chance for the shark. Each of you may pick one animal from the bowl." The animal Sean picked was not a shark. It wasn't even a lion or a tiger or a grizzly bear or an orca or a Tyrannosaurus Rex. It was a leopard seal. "A seal?" whispered Sean. Great White Shark was picked by Stacy. Sean said, "I'll trade with you." He said, "I have to be the shark. I'll bring you cookies every day." Stacy shook her head. She smiled. She opened her mouth wide, very wide. At home, Sean looked through his shark books, hoping that what he remembered about sharks and seals was wrong. Dun, dun, dun. No, it wasn't wrong. He hoped Stacy wouldn't find out. She found out. Tuesday on the playground, Stacy leaned close and said, "Did you know that sharks eat seals?" Sean nodded. "But not if they can't catch them." Chomp, chomp, chomp. Stacy opened her mouth very wide and ran as fast as she could, but she couldn't catch Sean. Sean loved how a seal could twist itself around in an instant and zip off in a different direction. The more Sean read about seals, the more he loved seals. He loved their streamlined shapes and the patterns of their smooth fur. He loved their big brown eyes. He loved their sharp little teeth, and he loved how they could sneak up on something tasty like a penguin and grab it with one bite. The more Stacy read about sharks, the more she loved sharks, and the more she chased Sean during recess. Chomp, 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 and after school, day after day, chomp, until Friday when Sean stopped. He stopped running, and he faced Stacy. "You're not much of a shark if you can't even catch a seal." Stacy closed her mouth. Her dark eyes were not blank. On Saturday, Sean remembered something about people. He filled his wagon with 126 shark books and pulled it to Stacy's house. Sean loved seals. He also loved sharks. And he knew that even a fast and clever seal could never be friends with a shark. Well, almost never. The end.
Now, how about another spooky story?
Oh, yes.
This is a retelling of Hansel and Gretel, and it's retold by Cynthia Rylant. Lucky me. And pictures are by Jen Chorus. It has been said that guardian spirits watch over and protect small children, and that may be so. But there are also stories of children who find the courage to protect themselves. Such is the story of Hansel and Gretel. Inside a stone cottage in a green forest, a young brother and a young sister, Hansel and Gretel, lived with their father and their stepmother. Their real mother had died. The family was very poor, for the father had been ill and unable to work for their bread. They were down to their last loaf. The new wife was very bitter about this. She had expected to be taken care of, and now there she was, nearly starving. She decided to blame the children. She said to her husband one night, "We cannot feed ourselves and feed your children at the same time. Because of them we are starving. Your children eat too much anyway. We must be rid of them." The father was distressed. "They mean no harm," he said. "They are but children." "Children or not, they are eating our bread," said the wife. "They have to go." There are many forms of wickedness in the world. Sometimes it is easy to recognize who is evil. Sometimes it is not easy at all. Wickedness can wear a smile just as goodness can. Hansel and Gretel would soon learn this hard lesson. Late in the evening, the children could not sleep, and they overheard their stepmother pleading to be rid of them. "We will take them deep into the forest and leave them there," the stepmother said. "They will never find their way back home. And what is ours will be ours alone." The father was a weak man. He had been so sad since the children's mother had died. Then all of his courage was gone. He agreed to do what his selfish wife told him to do, for he had no fight left in him. In her little bed, Gretel began to cry softly. "Oh, brother," she whispered, "what are we to do?" Hansel, however, was not afraid. He possessed the courage his father lacked and would do what was necessary to protect his sister. "Don't worry, Gretel," whispered Hansel. "You will not die. Trust me." When Gretel had finally cried herself to sleep and the house was still, Hansel crept outside Under the light of a full moon, he filled his pockets with small white pebbles from a pathway near the door. The next day, the children's father and stepmother dressed the children for a walk. "We will go together into the forest and find some flowers," the stepmother said with a smile. As they went farther and farther away from their cottage, every so often Hansel would drop down as though to look for a leaf. What he was really doing, however, was dropping small white pebbles. When finally they reached the deep part of the forest, the father and stepmother told the children to sit under a tree and wait for them. "We will find good berries for you to eat," said the stepmother with a smile. The children waited all night. By morning, they were waiting still. "It is time to go home," said Hansel, and they followed the trail of the small white pebbles all the way back home. Their father was happy to see them. Their stepmother pretended to be. That night, the children again overheard their stepmother plotting to be rid of them. "Tomorrow we will take them deep into the forest. They will never come home again," she said. And again Hansel waited until everyone was asleep, so he might gather the small white pebbles that would lead them home. But this night the door had been barred and Hansel could not get out, so he carefully cut away a piece of the last loaf of bread and put it in his pocket. The next day the children were again dressed to go into the forest. "We will look at the birds," said the stepmother with a smile. And as they walked deeper and deeper into the dark forest, Hansel stopped now and then, as though inspecting some small thing. In fact, he was dropping crumbs of bread from his pocket. The father and stepmother again told the children to wait under a tree, promising this time certainly to return with berries. The children waited all night. By morning they were waiting still. "It is time to go home," said Hansel. But a most terrible thing had happened. As the children slept, the little mice of the forest had eaten every crumb of bread. The children were now completely alone, completely lost. Gretel began to cry softly. "We will be all right, Gretel," said Hansel. "Take courage." They began to walk, hoping to find help. After some time, and suffering so with hunger, the children came upon a little white house in the forest, surrounded by beautiful flowers. It was so pretty. It looked good enough to eat. Yum. In fact, it was good enough to eat. The children discovered the house was made of cake and sugar, and they set right to nibbling at it. Hansel pulled off a bit of shutter and put it in his mouth. Gretel tasted the window boxes. Suddenly a voice called from within the house. "Children dear, children fair, I love children everywhere." And the door opened, and there stood an old woman wearing a smile. She welcomed Hansel and Gretel into her home, and she fed them warm food and put them to bed under an eiderdown. The children were so very grateful. But once they were asleep, the old woman picked them up and put them in cages behind the house. When Hansel and Gretel woke up in the morning and realized what had happened, they knew that the old woman was actually a witch. Her smile was gone. The witch liked to eat little children, but she liked them plump and juicy, and Hansel and Gretel were much too thin. She would first have to fatten them up. She made Gretel help her with the cooking and left Hansel in his cage. She planned to eat Hansel first. Each day the witch checked on his plumpness. "Stick out your finger so I may see how fat you are," the witch told Hansel. Hansel was not only a brave child, he was a smart child. He had noticed the witch's failing eyesight. So each day, instead of putting his finger between the bars of the cage, he stuck out a chicken bone. "Too skinny," shouted the witch, and she ordered Gretel to cook more food. This went on for many days, and for many days the witch thought Hansel had not gotten any plumper. The witch finally exploded with impatience. "I will eat him anyway," she screamed at Gretel, "and then I will eat you." The witch ordered Gretel to build a fire in the great stone oven. Crying softly, Gretel did as she was told. But as she worked, she remembered what her brother Hansel had told her. "Take courage, Gretel." Gretel made the fire hot and roaring. When the fire was hot enough for roasting, the witch said, "Crawl in, girl. See if the fire is ready." The witch was now secretly planning to roast Gretel first, since Gretel herself had plumped up nicely. Once the girl was inside the oven, the witch was going to shut the door. Gretel, however, happened to be as smart as her brother. She looked at the open oven. I'm not sure I can get in, Gretel said. I believe it is too small for anyone to fit in there. "Ha, silly goose," said the witch. "It's big enough. Look, even I can fit in." And the witch thrust her head inside the oven door. In that instant, Gretel, strong from all her hard work, pushed with all her might and pushed the witch right into the oven. The little girl slammed the oven door shut. "We are saved," Gretel shouted, and she ran to release her brother. They cried happy tears for being alive. Then the children filled their pockets with bits of food and some pieces of gold from the witch's treasure box and set out, somehow to find their way back home. Perhaps this is when guardian spirits finally intervene, when small children have already been so brave. For when Hansel and Gretel came to a river, a large white swan was waiting for them. They crossed the river on its back, and when they were on land again, they knew they were very close to home. Running as fast as they could, they reached out for their father, who heard them and came running toward them. He picked them up in his arms and held them and cried 1,000 tears for their safe return. The children's stepmother had died from eating a poisonous mushroom and finally released from her spell. Their father, too, had nearly died from the shame of having abandoned his children. But now joy and forgiveness were everywhere. The family had enough pieces of gold to buy 500 loaves of bread. They would have enough food for the remainder of their days. Love would take care of the rest. The end.
Oh, that's a good story.
A classic there.
Yes. This next story I have is called Aunt Nancy and Old Man Trouble. It's by Phyllis Root and illustrated by David Parkins. I like this story. Aunt Nancy and Old Man Trouble. Aunt Nancy should have known Old Man Trouble was in the neighborhood. Hadn't the spring out back gone and dried up this morning when she went to fill her water bucket? And when she bent over the spring hole to see what had happened to the water, didn't her good luck 3-legged wooden buffalo nickel fall right out of her pocket, bloop, into the hole, and no way to fetch it up again? Here was the sun barely poking up at the sky, and already bad luck was hopping around like rabbits at a family reunion. Aunt Nancy should have known Old Man Trouble was around all right. But she didn't. When there came a knocking and a thumping on her door, what did she do but open it? And there stood Old Man Trouble. He was dressed in a long black cloak, tall black hat, and shiny black shoes. He was swinging a silver-headed walking stick, and his pointy white teeth gleamed in his pointy black beard. "Good day to you, ma'am," says Old Man Trouble, sliding into one of those shiny black shoes into the doorway. Quick as a whisker, Aunt Nancy slams the door and bolts it shut. She knows who Old Man Trouble is, all right, and no way is she going to let him in. "Now, ma'am," says Old Man Trouble from the other side of the door, "you know it ain't no use to try and keep me out. Bolt your doors and windows shut, I'll just drift down your chimney. Plug up your chimney flue, I'll blow in through your cracks on the wall. Might as well open the door and let me in." Old Man Trouble keeps knocking on the door. Sooner or later, he knows Aunt Nancy's going to have to let him in. Aunt Nancy, she sees the truth of that, but she knows a thing or two herself. So when Old Man Trouble knocks again, Aunt Nancy winks at her cat Ezekiel, opens the door wide, and says, "Might as well come on in." Old Man Trouble steps in through the door as big as you please. Ezekiel takes one look and hisses and howls and shoots out the door faster than a firecracker on the 4th of July. Fast as he is, Ezekiel isn't fast enough. The door nips shut on his tail, and he lights off for the nearest tree, yowling and howling. That's the kind of thing happens when Old Man Trouble comes around. Aunt Nancy shuts the door and says, all polite, "Seat yourself and stay a spell." "Don't mind if I do," says Old Man Trouble. "I wouldn't say no to a cup of tea neither." So Aunt Nancy puts the kettle on the fire, and the next thing you know, the fire's gone, and the next thing you know, she blows on the coals to start it up again, and all she gets is a face full of ashes. Out of the corner of her eye, she spies Old Man Trouble grinning. But Aunt Nancy, she pretends not to notice. "Well, now, here's a blessing," says Aunt Nancy. "The fire's gone out. And a good thing, too, a hot day like this. I'll just get a nice cool glass of water for you. There's a drop or two left in the bucket." Aunt Nancy reaches for a glass of water. And don't that glass just kind of jump sideways out of her fingers, splash water down her front, and crash in a million pieces on the floor. Old Man Trouble's still grinning through his beard, but Aunt Nancy, she makes like she don't see him. "Whoo-wee, don't that feel good," she says. "Cools me right off." Old Man Trouble, he's not grinning quite so big anymore as Aunt Nancy sweeps up the pieces. "And there's another blessing," she said. "Didn't that glass have a crack in it, and me too cheap to throw it out? Now nobody'll get themselves cut trying to drink out of it." Old Man Trouble, he's not grinning much at all. "And I'd get you another glass," said Aunt Nancy, "but the spring's done gone dry this morning." "Sit yourself down and rest then," said Old Man Trouble. Aunt Nancy starts to sit in a chair when, creak, crack, the chair's lying on its side with one leg broken, and ka-thunk, Aunt Nancy sitting on the floor. "Now, ain't that a mercy?" Aunt Nancy says, picking herself up. "Just when I was wondering where I was going to get me some kindlin' wood." Old Man Trouble stomps his silver-headed walking stick on the floor. Aunt Nancy can see he's mighty upset. "Don't nothing bother you, ma'am?" says Old Man Trouble through his teeth. "Ha! Not today it don't," said Aunt Nancy, fetching her rocking chair. "I just knowed it was my lucky day when I saw that spring dried up this morning. No more mud tracking up my floor, no more dampness aching my bones." Old Man Trouble starts to grin again. "Huh, reckon that'd be a real trouble to you, ma'am, if that spring come back again," he says. "Ah, that it would," Aunt Nancy says, "but being as this is my lucky day, I'm not too worried. You brought me nothing but good luck, and I thank you kindly." "I better be getting along then," says Old Man Trouble. Aunt Nancy sees him to the door. "Come again," she says, all polite. "Oh, I will," says Old Man Trouble, stepping outside. "Say, ma'am," he asks, "do you hear water running somewhere?" Aunt Nancy shakes her head. "Don't hear a thing," she says. Old Man Trouble grins so hard, his face is about to split. "You will, ma'am," he says. He tips his hat and sets off down the road, swinging his walking stick and humming to himself. Aunt Nancy watches the back of Old Man Trouble, away down the road. All the while she's listening to the sweet sound of water gurgling, and she's grinning. Pretty big herself. "Come on down, Cat," she says to Ezekiel up in his tree. "You and me can sit and rock and rest a spell." Aunt Nancy, she figures she's earned it. The end.
Yay for Aunt Nancy.
What a tricky lady.
She is tricky. Well, I think I have a theme going of children who are courageous and smart.
Ah, very good.
It's repeated here in this book, Callie Ann and Mr. Bear, retold by Robert D. Sansucci, and pictures by Don Daly. And here we go. Callie Ann lived in the old times when animals could talk. Her papa had died, so Callie Ann and her ma worked hard to make a go of their small farm. Many men courted the pretty widow. She refused them all. Callie Ann wished her ma would marry Mose, who plowed the fields. But her mama just said, "He's a good man, but he's common as a shoe. I plan to marry a quality gentleman." "Yes'm," her daughter said. Still, Callie Ann thought good-natured, hard-working Mose would make a fine stepdaddy. One day, a stranger rolled up from the piney woods. He wore a fancy coat, white spats, and a broad hat pulled down low. "I come to pay respects, ma'am," he said with a bow. He patted Callie Ann's head with his hand as big as a shovel and said, "Pretty little girlie, you got near as pretty as her mom." "Thank you kindly," said Callie-Ann's mother, smiling. "Do come into the kitchen and set a spell." She whispered to Callie-Ann, "Now here's a quality gentleman. See how well he's dressed." The girl tried to be polite, but she couldn't help staring. The big fellow's chair groaned as he gobbled down sugar cookies and spooned the sugar bowl empty to sweeten his lemonade, and he always kept his hat brim between his face and the mother and daughter. "You surely got a sweet tooth," Callie-Ann's ma exclaimed. "The cookies are gone, but I could fix biscuits and honey." "I won't say no, ma'am," the man answered. Well, the biscuits, swimming with honey, disappeared as fast as the cookies. When the stranger opened wide to swallow his last biscuits, Callie-Ann saw he had a mouthful of big, sharp yellow teeth. Then the girl spotted brown fur peeping through a hole in one white spot. But when she tugged on her mama's sleeve to show her, the woman scolded, "Child, you're as jumpy as a worm in hot ashes. Get yourself outside and leave us be." So Callie-Ann went and played with the dogs who were chained behind the old house. Near evening, the stranger left, saying, "I'll come calling tomorrow." Callie-Ann followed him into the woods. There he pulled off his coat and trousers, and Callie-Ann was scared to see it really was Mr. Bear. Frightened, Callie-Ann ran home and said, "Mama, that fellow's really Mr. Bear who's just come to eat whatever we got that's sweet." "Hush, child," her mother said, "telling lies about a quality gentleman. One more word and I'll send you to bed with no supper." Callie-Ann stayed awake most of the night studying what to do. In the morning, she found Mr. Bear sitting in the kitchen. He was drinking iced tea sugared thick as syrup, gobbling molasses cookies. Callie-Ann shouted, "No more tricks, you old bear!" and she knocked his hat clean off his head. With a mighty roar, Mr. Bear burst out of his clothes. Callie-Ann and her mother ran out the door shouting for Mose. Quick as a wink, Mose unchained his snarling, snapping dogs. Mr. Bear shook his paw at Callie-Ann. "You ain't seen the last of me, girlie," he yelled. Then he hightailed it for the piney woods. From then on, Callie-Ann often saw Mr. Bear lurking at the edge of the woods. Worried, she asked Mose, "What should I do?" "I got to go away for a couple of days," Mose said. "Any time you leave the farm, set out a bowl of milk. If your mama sees it turn red and boil, that means you're in trouble. Then she's got to loose the dogs right away." Shortly after Mose left, the two ladies came to the porch where Callie-Ann's ma was churning butter. Callie-Ann was tying up bean vines nearby, and the two ladies had pretty fluffed out petticoats, bonnets with long bells, and parasols of green silk, and long white gloves. "Ma'am," one lady called, "it's so hot. Could you please give my sister and me a little honey?" "Wouldn't you rather have cool water?" asked Callie-Ann's mother. "No, ma'am," said the old lady. "Honey'll perk us up just fine." So Callie-Ann's ma brought out the honey jar and a spoon. Ignoring the spoon, first one lady, then the other ate noisily. Callie-Ann whispered, Mama, they're licking the honey right out of the jar." "That must be how quality folks eat," her mother said. "Just look how fine they's dressed." When she gave back the empty jar, the first lady said, "That girlie of yours looks a clever child. Could she show us the path through the woods?" Callie-Ann cried, I don't want to go." But her ma scolded, "Shame on you, carrying on in front of quality folk. Mind your manners and help these nice ladies." "Yes'm," Callie-Ann said. Before she left, she put out a dish of milk, the way Mose had told her, and she said, "Mama, if this turns red and boils, you loose those dogs." When her mama agreed, Callie-Ann set off skipping, and the ladies had to hurry to keep up. Soon they were panting in their heavy dresses that they puffed their veils up. Callie-Ann spied shaggy brown ears on one and a furry snout on the other. She ran for the tallest pine. The ladies dropped to all fours and raced after her, but Callie-Ann scrambled up the tree just ahead of them. The first lady called, "Girlie, come down and show us the path through the woods." "Just keep on the way you're going," Callie-Ann yelled back. The second lady shouted, "We'll tell your mama how bad you are. Just tell her how scared I am of ladies with fuzzy ears and noses who run like four-legged critters," Callie-Ann answered. At this, the ladies pulled off their dresses and gloves, and Callie-Ann saw two big she-bears snarling up at her. They couldn't climb the tree because they had trimmed their claws to put on their gloves and shoes. "Come down here, girlie," they roared. "We got to take you to our brother bear. He's mighty cross with you." They shook the tree something fierce, and Callie-Ann clung for dear life. But at home, the milk in the dish turned red and boiled. So Callie-Ann's mother freed the hounds who raced for the woods. When Callie-Ann saw them, she yelled, "Here, dogs, here!" "Dogs coming," warned the first bear. "Sister, get going," cried the other, and off they bolted, chased by the barking hounds. Then Calian climbed down. She began walking home, but she was so busy thinking about bears she took a wrong turn, and at dusk, dark, she realized she was lost in the woods. She was pretty worried until she saw a light in the cabin window. When no one answered her knock at the door, she pushed it open. The place was lit by a chimney fire and candles. A tall mirror stood in one corner. Ash cakes were cooling on the table. Looking out the window behind them, Calian saw a fast-flowing river far below. Suddenly, she spotted through that door Mr. Bear galumphing down the path. He carried a chunk of honeycomb, and he angrily rubbed his sore nose. Calian slammed the barred front door. Mr. Bear rattled it. "Who's in my house?" he demanded. Calian did not answer. Mr. Bear pounded on the door. "I brung honey for my ash cakes, and I want 'em before they get cold." Calian thought, if Mr. Bear and his sisters can pretend to be quality folks, I'll pretend to be a bear. She dragged a stool over to the door and stood on it. When Mr. Bear asked again, "Who's there?" Calian cupped her hands and growled out in a growly voice, "Bigger bear." "I'm the biggest bear around," Mr. Bear roared. "I'm bigger," the girl yelled back, standing on tiptoe so her mouth was higher than Mr. Bear's head. "Go away so I can finish these ash cakes." "That's my supper," cried Mr. Bear, and he shook the door even harder than before. "Get, for I have to come out and whip you," Calian said. "I already ran off 2 she-bears for practice." "Them's my sisters," Mr. Bear cried. "Now I'm boiling mad," and he threw himself against the door. Calian poured water on the fire to fill the place with smoke, pinched out all the candles, then pushed the mirror in front of the window above the river. She put the last lit candle by the mirror, then she hid. A moment later, Mr. Bear broke down the door. "I'll show you the bigger bear," he bellowed. Through eye-stinging smoke, Mr. Bear saw his blurry reflection in the candlelit mirror. Thinking it was his rival, he charged. With a crash, Mr. Bear and the mirror tumbled out the window and into the river below, which swept them away. In the morning, Calian found her way home. Her mother hugged her tight, while her dogs jumped up and licked her face. When Mose got back, he laughed so loudly to hear how Calian had tricked Mr. Bear. Before long, Calian had Mose for a stepdaddy. Seems her mama had had enough of folks who only seemed like quality, so she married the real thing. Later, Calian had a new sister and brother, too. The farm prospered, and so did the family, and they never had any more trouble with bears, neither. The end.
Wonderful. Thank you, and come to the library. We'll see you there. Bye-bye.